Welcome back. Now that we've taken a look at the liver and its work in terms of lipids, we'll take a little bit closer look at how those lipids end up moving throughout the body itself. Because as we know, we have lipids themselves are a hydrophobic substance, so they don't like water, which means if they're in the water, as we saw before, they're going to separate. So we can't have that inside the blood, otherwise essentially all the lipids would kind of float to the top of us. So in order to allow them to be able to move through the body in the bloodstream, we need to bind them to a protein. And so we're going to wrap a protein. We saw that before with the micelle surrounding the lipids themselves. And so we had a little bit of a, I'll do it orange. We had a little bit of a lipid, and then we surrounded it with our proteins. And we created something that could now float in the blood. And so we have water all around it, water next to those proteins, and we're able to allow them to travel. So they're going to go from the small intestines, and typically they're going to move into the lymphatic system through the lacteals in the small intestines. And so they're going to move into the small intestines through those myceles, get into the lymph and the blood, and through the lacteals in the lymph, make their way up into the thoracic duct, and then dump into the venous blood there up in the neck. And so we're going to dump into that subclavian vein, and from there it's then going to essentially get dispersed. And so it's going to potentially move over to the liver, potentially move over to adipose, and it's going to then be processed in those particular areas. So depending upon kind of where the lipids themselves are going determines which kind of a lipid we have. And so when it comes to going to the doctors and getting a lipid panel done, so they want to find out what your cholesterol is and what your triglycerides and your lipid counts are in your blood, they're going to do a lipid panel. And part of what you're going to see there typically are things like LDL, VLDL, and then HDL. And then you'll also see specifically usually just triglycerides by themselves, things like that. And what they're measuring is the amount of each of those substances in the blood. And depending upon what you have for them kind of dictates what potentially is going to be going on. And so when it comes to these lipoproteins, so we either have VLDLs, which are the lipoproteins themselves are of a very dense lipoprotein. And so the components themselves are there, and we're going to be able to move them in different areas. Excuse me. So we have these very low density lipoproteins, and then we have low density lipoproteins, and then we have high density lipoproteins. Each one kind of has its own job in terms of what it's carrying. So our very low density, our VLDLs, are having a large amount of triglycerides, a relatively small amount of cholesterol, and those triglycerides are going to get delivered to the adipose tissue, so our adipocytes, and we're going to drop them off there for storage. And so those are going to get dropped off there in the storage component, and they go from there. The LDLs are, rather than kind of carrying the triglycerides, they're now carrying a large amount of cholesterol, and that cholesterol is either going to go out to the tissues. So we're going to the tissues, and at the tissues themselves, our cells are going to be able to utilize that cholesterol. And so if you remember back to the cell membranes, as much as like 20% of the plasma membrane is actually made up of cholesterol. So our cells, as we make new cells, as our cells are going through their normal processes, they're there and they're going to manufacture the things they need to do, whether it be things like hormones, new cells, all kinds of different things that those cells could happen to need that cholesterol for. If the cells don't need it at that time and we still have an excess of cholesterol, then that cholesterol may end up getting essentially accumulated into things like arterial walls. And so with that, it's not like it's on the inside. It's not like a pipe or something where we have kind of a clog on the inside of the pipe and we could go in there and kind of router it out and clean everything out and everything would be good again. It's where the actual walls of the blood vessel have separated, and that cholesterol plaquing is getting deposited in between the layers of the vessel. And so they're actually stuck inside there. And so if we have an excess amount of cholesterol, that's what ends up happening. So this can happen in the things like the blood vessels going to the heart, and so our coronary arteries. This can happen in blood vessels going up to the brain, the carotids, things like that. And they're going to potentially cause a limit in terms of the amount of blood that can actually flow through. This can also lead to later on where those plaques actually start to calcify and harden over time as well. So we have a cholesterol plaque, and so the left picture has an actual artery where that plaquing has been seen there. And with that, you can see that we have the layer of endothelium here, and then we have the plaquing underneath. And all of that plaquing is deep to the vessel wall itself. And you can see that essentially the vessel wall should be right in there. And this particular vessel is roughly 50% occluded. And so it's going to have a large amount of decreased flow through that particular area. And that's not good, especially if it's going to places like the heart or the brain. We don't want that decreased blood flow to cause any problems in those particular areas. So it mentioned that we also have our HDLs, our high density lipoproteins that we have. And so these ones have a large amount of cholesterol packaged into them. But the thing is with this one is that we're taking it from the tissues and delivering it over to the liver. And so we're going to take that cholesterol, whether it's packaged up into places like the blood vessels, and we can kind of clean that out of there, or whether it's in the tissues themselves, in and around them. We're basically picking up, taking back excess amounts of cholesterol that would otherwise potentially be causing us harm in our blood vessels. And so that takes that cholesterol back to the liver. It drops off the cholesterol. So the cholesterol was there. Now there's no cholesterol. And then it can go back to the tissues once again and pick up more cholesterol. So we want to have a large amount of HDLs. So in terms of our lipid panel, we want to have relatively high HDLs. We want to have low LDLs. So our low density ones that are containing that cholesterol that's going to the tissues or to the blood vessels, we don't want to have a whole lot of those. So we want to keep those numbers down. We want to keep those HDL levels up. When the body is doing its thing, so to speak, we have metabolism. And so the normal metabolic rate of the body equals the amount of energy that's being used on a daily basis. And so we have things that are happening to move us around the environment. And so we have our external work. These are our skeletal muscles basically contracting to move us around, move us through the environment, getting us to what we need to do, go exercise, all of those types of things. That's where the external workload is coming from for the body. And that uses up a fair amount of energy, especially if you're active. Internally, we're going to use energy in the form of typically our glucose. Oops. Can't spell today. Or glucose. And that's going to then get converted into ATP in the tissues, similar to that for our skeletal muscle. But that's going to allow for things like active transport, moving things in and out of cells, allows for our smooth muscle all over the body to be able to function. It allows our heart to function. We're doing things as far as glandular secretions, hormone production, endocrine function, all of those different processes there. We need energy in order to make proteins, and so that kind of goes along with the glandular secretions as well. So as we're manufacturing those hormones from the glands and making them, this all requires a certain amount of energy every day. And so we have essentially what we would call our basal energy needs. And so we have this amount of energy that is there throughout the day. And this is where when you go to a store or even like say a fast food restaurant or something, and nowadays they have all of the calorie content for all the things that you can order there. And with that, somewhere on the bottom, there's the nice little asterisk that's there. And then it says, that it's based on a 2,000 calorie per day diet. Meaning that for the average person, which is typically in terms of that average and in terms of what we are talking about, we're talking about a 150-pound male person needs roughly 2,000 calories per day, basically just to meet most of these internal processes. Anything above that is going to lead to an excess. Anything below that, if that's what you're actually using throughout the day, anything below that number is going to lead to us starting to burn other storage forms of energy within the body throughout the day. So if we want to maintain body weight, so if our goal is maintenance, our energy in has to equal the energy out. And so essentially the inputs and the outputs have to equal one another. So our input equals our output. So the amount of energy that we eat throughout the day, so whatever that happens to be, so say that's 2,000 calories. If we burn 2,000 calories throughout the day, then we're going to maintain body weight. Body weight's going to stay the way that it was. If we control all of that, then all is well. The problem is that when it comes to essentially our ability to eat, food for the most part, for most people, is readily available. And so although the hypothalamus has a strong control over our regulatory mechanisms for controlling hunger and satiety and things like that, we have this little thing that we call will. And so our will allows us to increase the amount of food that we eat if we want to. And so we don't have to necessarily listen to just our stomach telling us when we are hungry. And so this control of appetite is a relatively complex process of hormones. And so we have many hormones that are going to tell us that we're full, and we have a primary one that's going to tell us that we're hungry. And so say it's first thing in the morning and you haven't eaten anything since dinner, the primary hormone that's going to get released is this hormone called ghrelin. And so this ghrelin hormone is the hormone that sends a signal up to the hypothalamus and says, hey, we're hungry. It's kind of like your stomach is growling. So ghrelin, grr, we're having this hunger. So we've sent this hormone over to the brain. The brain says, okay, we're hungry. The stomach is empty. There's nothing really going on inside the stomach. There's no food there. There's nothing that says that we've had a meal recently. We send off that ghrelin off to the hypothalamus, and we feel hunger. We may even hear our stomach rumbling in terms of it kind of churning around, trying to find something to digest and so on within it. After we've had a meal, a few other things happen. And so this is kind of the argument for eating slowly in terms of our meals, is that it allows all of these hormonal controls to get up to the brain to tell us that we're full. And so some of them start relatively quickly as soon as we start to get food into the stomach. And so the release of ghrelin is going to be inhibited. From there, once we start to dump food into the small intestines, we're going to start to get the release of things like cholecystokinin. We're going to get our GIP, which is a insulin-like type of a protein that's there. And so those proteins and those hormones are going to head up to the hypothalamus saying, hey, there's food in here. We've got food in our small intestines, as well as the large intestines sends off those same types of hormones that says there's food here. We've got a meal to digest. We don't really need any more energy. We're full. You can stop eating. We're going to be fine for a little while. Once the food products start to hit the blood, and especially when we start to talk about glucose, we're going to get the release of insulin. And once we have the release of fats into the body, we're going to get leptin. And so leptin gets released both when it comes to fats being in a meal, but also it's also dependent upon the numbers of adipocytes and the size of those cells. Kind of the larger that those cells are, the more leptin that's going to be produced and the less hungry that the person is going to feel at any given time. So kind of the more that's there, the more leptin that gets produced. All that being said, we eat when we're not even hungry. And so periods of time during, there was the COVID infection, and with that, there was the jokes early on of your COVID-15, and so, or maybe your COVID-19. You've gained 15, 19 pounds because you're home. Food's in the kitchen, food's in the pantry. You're off and you're going and you're snacking when you're not even necessarily hungry. You're more bored than anything else. Or it becomes, rather than studying your homework, it's easier to go get a snack. Or maybe you want a snack while you are studying, things like that. So we have the ability to kind of override all of those hormonal controls that normally would tell us that we should eat or should not eat on those. And the same thing even goes for other animals. Your cat or your dog. Most cats and dogs, if you leave food out all day long, they will just eat and eat and eat and eat, and they're not going to have those kinds of signals that tell them to stop. Because especially with cats and dogs, there's the potential that they might not get a meal for another while. They don't necessarily know in the wild that where their or when their next meal is coming, so they need to, in a sense, gorge when they can. So we take in all this food every day. We have all this food that is available in our body in the form of stored components. And so we have our carbohydrates, our fats, and our proteins. So if you decide, say, today, right now, that you're going to stop eating, you're going to fast, you're going to have the ability to kind of power your body in a couple of different ways. And so you can pull energy from a couple of different reserves that you have at any given time. And so we talked about before the fact that glucose, when we have excess amounts of glucose, it gets stored away as glycogen. And that glycogen gets stored in places primarily like the liver and the skeletal muscle. And as such, there's roughly enough energy for a day. This is going to be enough for us to basically power our body for one single day. So we can easily fast for a single day, and all we're going to have done is just gotten rid of our glucose stores. Depending upon the state that we were in when we started that fast as well is going to dictate kind of how quickly we run out of it. And when we do run out of it, we're going to be able to go and search for some triglycerides. That was the storage form of our fatty acids. We have our triglycerides, we have our glycerol, we have other things, monoglycerides, that are stored away and we can use for energy within the body. And those are all found in those adipocytes. And so those are going to be in the adipocytes. And with that, depending upon the person, we're going to have a huge amount of storage there. Some people obviously have a lot more of this storage in the form of fat. And so just comparatively, we have potentially 143,000 calories worth. And so with that, we're going to be able to power the body for a much longer time on those fat stores than we could on the carbohydrate stores. And then somewhere along the line, we're going to start to move into proteins. And so proteins obviously are primarily coming from skeletal muscle. And certainly if we are, again, not using our external sources for food, our body will eventually start to break down proteins. And as such, it's going to start to pull those proteins from the muscles. It's going to utilize them for basically everything else that is in the body. Anything and everything else that needs to make a protein, it's going to do so by pulling those proteins and those amino acids out of the skeletal muscle that we already had. And with that, death is going to be way before we've basically gotten rid of all of our muscle. So even somebody who has essentially failure to thrive, they're just not doing anything, they're not eating, they're not moving, et cetera, they're still going to have some muscle mass. There's still going to be some muscle there, even though they're not getting the energy that they need on there. And there's all kinds of disorders, and especially if we don't have protein in our diet. So if somebody goes on a no protein diet and all that they're going to get is carbohydrates and fats, they're going to have to earlier, even if they're not fasting, steal from the muscle. So they're going to pull from those muscles for the proteins that they need. And as they're going to do that, they're going to pull out those proteins from the muscle. Their muscles are going to start to atrophy, and we're going to see a loss of muscle mass. So when it comes to kind of all of the nutrients that we get in terms of our macronutrients, we have our proteins, we have our carbohydrates, and we have our triglycerides, or our fats, our lipids that we're getting from diet itself. That gets broken down, and we're going to absorb amino acids, glucose, fatty acids, monoglycerides in different ways into the body itself. And once it gets into there, we basically have all of those able to be utilized in order to make ATP. And so we can have that in there. Our primary way, obviously, to make ATP is going to be through glucose. And so if we need to make ATP within the body, we're going to have that glucose there, and we're going to make the greatest amount of ATP with it. And so we're going to get lots and lots and lots of ATP by oxidizing that glucose that's there. And that's going to give us all that we need. If we have excess amounts, we're going to store it away as glycogen. For the amino acids, if we're eating a high protein diet, things are going to come out in that way as well. We can put them away into our body as the proteins that we need, but if we're getting more amino acids, say you're eating a low carbohydrate diet and you're getting all amino acids and fatty acids as your diet, and you're cutting out the glucose, that means that any excess amounts of amino acids that you're utilizing for your normal protein synthesis can be used for ATP production. So we can make glucose out of it and utilize those amino acids for our energy if needed. But at the same time, if we don't use them all up, we're going to excrete those amino acids. They're going to be eliminated from the body via urine. And then lastly, we have our fatty acids. Fatty acids, obviously, we just talked about, can be utilized for energy. So we can break down those lipids in the adipocytes that have been stored away. So we have our triglycerides there. We can pull them back out and utilize them for energy as well. And we can get a large amount of energy out there. So all depending upon kind of the state that we're in terms of metabolism at any given time is going to determine which way we kind of go as far as the very convoluted circle, in a sense, of our metabolism that we have here. Next up, we'll start to talk about the ability of our body in terms of metabolism to regulate our body temperature.